maybe a good place for me to start to discuss the issue of U.S.-China relations is with the book of a good friend of mine, someone very well known in our country, who's very clever, and I fundamentally hope he's wrong, but he keeps on being right about things, and that's John Mearsheimer. And many of you follow Professor Mearsheimer at University of Chicago. And he wrote a very good book that, again, I really disagree with, but it's a great book. In 2001, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And as our super realist in international relations, John sees great power politics as being filled with confrontation and frictions, and basically a kind of struggle for survival, and very much a zero-sum world in which the gains of one side are the losses of the other in this power struggle. And as an economist, I see the world very differently, because the actual basic idea that goes back to Adam Smith is that an interconnected economy is a win-win proposition, that economics is not zero-sum, but positive-sum, that there are gains from cooperation, gains from the division of labor, gains from specialization, gains from a large market that creates an acceleration of innovation, and gains from the fun of being in a world in which you can taste other people's food, enjoy their culture, listen to their music, travel to their societies, and benefit from cultural diversity. Well, I go back to John Mearsheimer because in his book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, he writes that at the time of that book, it's either 2001 or 2002, I don't remember exactly, he says, great power politics is quiet right now, but we will get back to confrontation. So give them a check mark. And he said, we'll have confrontation between the US and China, because China's going to rise, China's going to become a much more powerful country, and that will lead to confrontation. And I read that and I thought, no, it's good if China rises, that's good. Win-win, gains. We want China to end poverty, to overcome the 100 years of humiliation, so-called, the great difficulties of the 19th century, indeed, up to really the start of the rapid economic growth in 1978. And that will be good. Why should there be controversy? Why should there be conflict? And John was right and I was wrong, because there is confrontation and there's conflict. I'm more right than he is, though, not in prediction, but in saying there's no reason for this conflict. This is not some fundamental struggle of survival. This is not some fundamental confrontation of two systems. This is not what Biden absurdly said upon taking office, that the great struggle of our age is democracy versus autocracy. None of this. This is what Mearsheimer said. China is rich and powerful. The United States is rich and powerful. Great powers have controversy over nothing more than the fact that they're each rich and powerful. That's a dumb reason for controversy, by the way. An even worse reason to blow up the world, or to talk about war as our politicians do. And my view is that we are being exposed to the unbelievable foolishness of our politicians every day. Hotheads who have not had the benefit of being at the Chinese Institute, know nothing, know no history, have no context, are ignorant, should get a passport, should go for a trip, should enjoy a holiday, and come back, calm down. But they don't. So Mearsheimer was right. We are in a really dangerous situation with China, but I'm also right. I can't see any single underlying reason for it that is a serious reason for confrontation. In economics, there's no such thing as China's gains being our losses. China is not a threat to the US economy. China is not a threat to US prosperity. China is not a threat to the US political system. We are the threat to the US political system. So there's nothing that has happened that gives me any worry about China. What gives me worry is about the structure of how the two countries are relating. So the second influential piece that I would refer to understand this is a remarkable essay, terrible in my view, by a former colleague of mine when we were at Harvard together, Robert Blackwell, well known, one of our leading diplomats. And he wrote a piece for the Council on Foreign Relations in, I think, 2016. It may be 2015. But it was about US grand strategy and China. It's really worth reading. Fascinating. Again, highly predictive, but terrible in my view, to put it bluntly. And I am blunt, so I want you to understand my point of view. So what Ambassador Blackwell wrote in 2015 or 2016 with Ashley Hellis, his co-author, is that, and it's there vividly, so it will really help if you haven't read it to understand the weirdness of what's going on. He wrote that America's grand strategy from the beginning of our country has been hegemony. First it was hegemony over the eastern seaboard, then it was hegemony over North America, then it was hegemony over the Americas, then it was the idea of global hegemony, that the US should be the dominant power in every region of the world and not brook even competition in any other region of a regional hegemon, so-called. These are all concepts of international relations. They don't make too much sense to me, frankly, in economics, but in any event, this is how our strategists think about things. So he wrote that that is our strategy, to be dominant. And China is a threat to that strategy. That is absolutely true. If your strategy is to be dominant, well, China's a big threat to that. Because how can you be dominant if there's a very successful country that happens to be 4 times larger in population, is doing very well, thank you, turns out hundreds of thousands of incredibly skilled PhDs in the sciences and technology. What is this dominance? How about being productive? How about being peaceful? How about having a nice life? How about having universal health coverage or other decent things which we might have in this country if we actually thought about it? But dominance, no. Then China's a threat, if that's your definition, which is mind-boggling to me, because suppose the whole world had the idea that the only goal is to be dominant. Well, if that is the way, then John Mearsheimer's right. It's all a tragedy, because not everybody can be dominant. And if that's your view, I suggest you go first to a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or a good counselor, or a good friend who could help calm you down and tell you about the good things in life, but not the importance of being dominant, because that really does create a problem if that were generalized. You could think about it in a Kantian way. That does not work as a categorical imperative if everybody is aiming for dominance. So, in this essay of Blackwell, our grand strategy is to be dominant. And so he writes very clearly, China's rise is no longer in America's interest. That's pretty weird. Now, we should understand a couple of basic things. China is roughly the same size as the US economy right now in aggregate. Depends how you measure things. There are always two ways to measure things. One is at the prices of each country's own markets, and then you convert the yuan output to dollar output with the market exchange rate, and that's called market prices. And the other is a common set of prices that you apply to the goods and services of each country. That's called purchasing power parity adjusted prices. And by the market prices, China's economy in the aggregate is something like 3/4 of the size of the US in dollar terms. China's 4 times larger. So that would mean 3/4 times 1/4, or 3/16 the size, or roughly in per capita terms, 20% of the US economy in total size, 3/4. If you look at it at international prices or purchasing power adjusted prices, China's a bigger economy. And the IMF gives us data all the time in what is called the World Economic Outlook. You can go to imf.org and just look at the data, which I do 10 times a day for my job. And if you look at the purchasing power adjusted prices, China is about 30% larger than the United States in absolute size. So 1.3 divided by 4, because the population is 4 times larger. So in per person terms, about 30% or 35% of the US. China's poorer per capita than the United States, but it's a big economy, because 1.4 billion people is a lot more than 335 million people, which is the US population. Now, that's freaking out the policymakers in the US. They're bigger. How dare they be bigger? But it's kind of arithmetic. The only way that China could be smaller than the US is to stay at a per capita income less than 1/4 of America. But why should they? Because China's filled with clever people, with good entrepreneurs, with technology. Technology flows in this world. It always has, and it will continue to. And China now is absolutely in the front ranks of scientific breakthroughs and of technological innovation, arguably ahead in many, many sectors, comparable in many, and behind in some. But a superpower in science and technology, and with superb universities and all of the things that make for a high-income country. And why not? China was the world leader for 1,000 years at least. It lost that lead by a terrible policy error in the year 1434, when the Ming court stopped the great fleet of Admiral Zheng He, and China went protectionist, and the next time it was really deeply exposed to the world is when British steamers were coming up the river to bomb the Qing imperial properties in the First Opium War. So China is going to be successful, and it's not going to stay at less than a quarter of US per capita income. It's going to continue to grow. And incidentally, you read these days op-eds, oh, China's miracle's over, China's finished, the Chinese economy is collapsing. This is so ignorant, I can't even tell you. China, by the way, will have business cycles like the United States does. It will have financial booms and busts. Nobody has figured out how to avoid financial crises in the last 300 years of market economy. So China, no doubt, has too much debt in some cities and in some real estate enterprises, no doubt. But China's going to continue to grow, and it's going to continue to narrow the gap with the United States in per capita terms. It's going to be bigger than the United States in absolute terms. It already is by one good measure, and it will be by the other good measure without doubt, unless there's global calamity of some sort, which I'm putting aside for the moment. And so the whole idea of American grand strategy is really messed up. And that is one large part of our problem right now. What Blackwell and Tellis recommended in this essay in 2015 or 2016, and when you read something on the Council on Foreign Relations, usually what's written is already policy, so it's letting the public know what the thinking in Washington is. It's not really even a trial balloon, it's already what's established. Blackwell says that China's rise is no longer in America's interest, and then there's a list of things that should be done. We should use trade policy to stop China's export growth. We should restrict the flow of technology to China. We should bolster our military alliances along the Pacific Rim countries. We should form trade groups in Asia that don't include China. One of the weirdest ideas imaginable, by the way. If they would ever look at a map, they would see that this is not really the most sensible idea in the world. But grown-ups in Washington, they're physically grown-ups. They actually did this. This was the whole idea of the TPP. Stupider, I can't imagine. But we have grown-ups that say, let's have a trade agreement in Asia where China's the lead trade partner of every one of the countries, and clever us, we won't include China. Okay, this is what passes for public policy. So Blackwell listed all the things that we should do, and we're doing all of them. First, in the instability of the Trump period, where there's a lot of noise to signal, so you never knew day to day what was really going on, nor did anyone else, including the president. But he started this process of unilateral trade measures and barking at China and generally trying to raise tensions. And then Biden came in, and I thought there would be some more grown-up behavior, as I said, and actually it got worse because it became more systematic, more systematically wrong. So what Biden did is just going through the list that Blackwell set out in 2016 or 2015, which is all the measures one takes of containment. And this is, one should understand, this is the third round of American policy in this regard. It was invented for the Soviet Union, and it was deployed in the 1950s vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And then, interestingly, it was deployed in a lighter way against Japan at the end of the 1980s and early 1990s, because Japan became so successful that even though Japan was our ally and has no army and everything else, Japan basically became an enemy in economic terms, and the United States landed very heavily on Japan and said, you can't export anymore to us, and you have to agree to that, you have to overvalue your currency by 50%, and you have to do all sorts of things because we're not going to let you continue to have the success. And we stopped Japanese growth. So this is the third try of this. But China's not Japan. Japan is 125 million people, and China's 1.4 billion people, and Japan is under the US security umbrella, and China is an independent superpower, and it's not going to sit still the way that Japan did in the early 1990s. China's going to figure out its way around all of this. But that was a big part of what we're seeing right now. So in a deep sense, Mearsheimer was right. China did nothing special to provoke any of this other than achieving rapid economic growth and economic progress. I see nothing extraordinary, of course. Every claim of China's success is they stole it from us, they cheated. This is both fantasy and prejudice mixed together with the fact that everybody steals a bit from everybody else, so there was nothing special about what China did. But in any event, it is the playbook, contain China, and that's a big part of what's going on. There's one other part of what's happening in our relationship, which is more economic, but also playing a role. And that is that when China achieved its economic success, heavily based on export-led growth, and heavily based on export-led growth to the US market, just as Adam Smith said, this made the US richer, it made China richer, it was a win-win proposition, the strong interrelations of China and the United States. But what you learn from trade history and trade theory both is that a win-win proposition at the aggregate level, that the US became a richer economy because China was becoming a richer economy, also went alongside inequalities within the United States, some of which arose from trade itself. So in international trade, there are losers as well as winners. The most basic theorem of international trade, going back to Smith and David Ricardo and Paul Samuelson in the 20th century, is that the winners win more than the losers lose, so that the overall size of the economy grows. And for everybody to win from trade, the winners should compensate the losers. So the idea is a growing economy, which the US has had, should be enough for everybody to rise in that economy. But instead, there are pockets in our, not just pockets in our society, significant parts of our society that are not rising, they're falling. So the US has become very rich, and the rich part of the United States has become really rich. And there are two parts of our society that are hurting. One is specifically places that are in the import competition with China, and that is the Midwest to an important extent. And those happen to be swing states in presidential elections. So Wisconsin, Minnesota, Ohio, my home state of Michigan, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and so forth. A lot of places there were hit by very high quality, low cost Chinese manufactured exports. And the second part of our society that's been hit in general is people with educational attainment of high school or less, because our society's absolutely diverged between university education and high school education on every dimension of well-being, including life expectancy, including health, including income levels, and so on. Now, in international trade theory and practice, the winners should help the losers. But we're a kind of nasty society. I think I would like to make that clear. Our political system was invented in the British mode of John Locke. John Locke, the philosopher at the end of the 17th century. And John Locke's idea was that you own your own labor and nobody should take it away from you. And that is pretty deeply embedded in the American psyche, which is, that's mine, thank you. And I don't want to be taxed. And we are a low-tax society that complains endlessly about taxes. That's the American tradition. In fact, there would be no United States of America other than for a tax revolt. The British wanted to put a little bit of tax on the Americans to help pay for the post-1763 costs after the 7 Years' War, and the colonists said, hell no, we don't have to pay any taxes, and no taxes without representation, and by the way, no taxes with representation. It's the American way as well, because our Congress is bought off by rich people who tell them, don't you dare ever charge us more taxes. That's how the American political system works. So, simply, the winners don't like to compensate the losers in the United States. In fact, they like to say, you're losers. And so Trump ran on this basis instead of running on what a nice party in Europe would run on, a social democratic platform that says, you know, we're all one society and we're awfully rich, and we should make sure that even if you lose your job, you have health care, and college education is too expensive, so we'll make sure that it's affordable. That's what a nice place would do. What Trump ran on was something completely different. He ran on tax cuts for the rich, and China is the one causing you all this. You see? Thank you, Donald. China's the one causing you all this pain. They stole your jobs. And I'm never going to let them get away with that. And so intersecting with our grand strategy, which is ridiculous, is the protectionism that comes from a society in which winners don't compensate losers, but winners deflect the blame by blaming foreigners. And Trump's whole campaign was, you can blame everyone else except rich people. Rich people we give tax cuts to, but blame the people coming up from the border from Mexico, or blame the Chinese, or blame the foreigners. That plays well. It makes a nasty society even nastier and more disorganized and disoriented, and he did a very good job of that. And the Democrats, what used to be my party before I decisively left it, I have no home politically. I'm just disgusted by all of it. The Democrats learned the lesson of 2016, which is, protectionism is the way to win power. So the Democrats are always learning from the Republicans. They learned from the Republicans in the 1980s, always advocate for tax cuts. That's how Reagan became so popular. And then the Democrat, and remember, well, you don't remember, but if you're as old as I am, you remember Walter Mondale said, he's going to raise taxes, I'm going to raise taxes, he's going to raise taxes too, he just won't tell you. And Mondale lost 49 states by saying that. And since then, no Democrat has said, we'll raise taxes. They just follow the Republicans. Then it used to be that the Republicans were free traders, and then Trump cleverly exploited the widening inequalities in the United States and turned it into an anti-China protectionism. And then the Democrats have learned that too. So, and then we have our grand strategist of our day, Jake Sullivan, who put the two pieces together and said, we can be protectionist and use this to contain China and win elections, and he's made a huge mess of everything by basically advising and helping to guide a policy where Biden came in and decided to double down on the anti-China sentiment and the anti-China policies. So in the first year of the administration, where I had a lot of former friends, they're not my friends anymore, I mean, I like them still, they don't like me anymore. But anyway, I said, oh, now reach out to your counterparts. We know all the technocrats in China, all the economic technocrats, of course, because we trained a lot of them. They're our students. They're friends for 30 years or 40 years. He said, no, the White House has said no contact. You can't have contact. We're reviewing our China policy. So for the first year, there was no discussion, basically. Even at the technocratic level, it was amazing. So wrong-headed, by the way. As an academic, I could keep all the contacts, talk to people, see friends, visit Beijing before COVID hit, and at least keep open channels, but the administration, no open channels at all. And then the idea was the tension must be good for our politics. We'll show how tough we are, we'll continue containment, we'll be more protectionist, we'll have a build in America policy, which is what what Biden is trying to do with the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act and so forth. And that is how things went, basically until about 6 months ago. I would add in Nancy Pelosi's absolutely absurd and reckless trip to Taipei. You just can't imagine more irresponsibility than that, in my opinion. And she is enormously irresponsible and just playing for the home crowd. But she went, and so Taiwan is added to this, and President Tsai in Taiwan has also been, in my opinion, irresponsible by rhetoric that is very loose, very dangerous, and in the midst of all of these other tensions, just raising the stakes in a way that allow our worst hotheads, and if you want our very worst hothead, it's Lindsey Graham, dumber you cannot get, and more militaristic you cannot get. He wants war everywhere. This week it's with Iran, but before that it was with China, before that it was with Russia. So this is really our state of affairs, that the protectionism, the grand strategy, the irresponsibility of Washington politicians, I think created all of this. I can't see, China made one mistake, by the way, rhetorically, and that was in 2014 when China launched the Made in China 2025 policy, which is a very smart policy calling for China to become leader in technology in 10 major areas. China said not that we want to advance in these areas, China said we want to dominate in these areas. We want to lead in these areas. That was not a good idea. It would have been much smarter to say, we want to advance in these areas. We could have saved a lot of grief by a different kind of rhetoric. So this is my basic interpretation of where we are right now. I said that it came to about 6 months ago when things were really boiling. I mean, very dangerous. The balloon incident, the war in Ukraine going not the way that the United States wanted or expected, another debacle of U.S. foreign policy, terrible debacle, because that's a war that never should have happened, and it was a war caused by this relentless idea of NATO enlargement to Ukraine, which is, talk about red lines. It's like Taiwan, but from Russia's point of view. You don't put the U.S. military on the Ukraine-Russia border, and they couldn't figure that out because they're not very clever at thinking through the eyes of the other side. So 6 months ago, things were really getting out of hand, and here we are. I think they decided about 6 months ago, this is not good. We need to start dialing back. And so that's why several of our cabinet secretaries went to China, why the rhetoric was toned down. Still, they can't quite calibrate this, because even when, say, Janet Yellen went, and she was saying we want good relations, Biden was at the same time signing another unilateral executive order to tighten the restrictions on technology exports to China. So we can't so far sustain quiet and calm. But I think the intention right now is, with an overloaded U.S. foreign policy, a failing war in Ukraine, a disaster in the Middle East, a president that's very unpopular, running against a probable convicted felon. It's a great scene. They want not so much tension in the next 12 months, and I think that that is the goal right now. And since there's no deep reason for this conflict, other than the ones that I've described, it would not be hard to dial back the tensions. It's not as if we are at dire loggerheads over anything real. We are in a constructed confrontation out of mindsets, not out of direct clash of interests. So finally, I am late and have to go, and am hogging the mic. China will have its ups and downs, but the main direction is not like that. The main direction is up. The most basic thing to watch is education, technology, and innovation. And on that, China's in the first ranks. And for an economy at China's level of development, that's the key. And that's not going away. That's going to continue. And China is leader, rightly, in many important technologies for the next 30 years, in digital technologies, in electric vehicles, in renewable energy, and many, many things. And the U.S. might continue to try to contain China, but it can't do it. Even the technology cutoffs will not have much effect at all. China's busy innovating around the microchips, and I would not worry too much about that. And if the U.S. blocks the U.S. market for China's goods, there's a whole world outside of the U.S. that wants Chinese goods, and that's what the Belt and Road Initiative and other similar initiatives of China, like the BRICS expansion, are after. So all in all, China will continue to develop. We should view that absolutely positively. It means better lives for the Chinese people. It means better opportunities for the world economy. It's better for the United States. China's progress is plus for the United States, and we should try to help our politicians make sense. Thank you very much.
We see from this election in Argentina, we see Iran deepening its economic ties with Russia now with this free trade agreement, but also linking itself to China. We see the wider Eurasian integration. We see now Russia's economic return to the Middle East, as we also in Saudi Arabia and UAE. This is quite putting on a bit of a spectacular show. And if we have time, of course, we'd like to look also at some of the solutions, if it's possible, to some of the economic and political challenges today, such as the sustainability of U.S. debt and the stability of the dollar, which I guess while many would like to see it had a lower or more weaker status in the world, collapse would be horrible probably for everyone. So, but if you don't mind, I thought we could start with Argentina, because for me this case is very strange. A hard time making sense of it. Obviously, Argentina has a lot of problem with inflation and other economic problems, so I can understand the appetite for radical reforms. But the election of Javier Milei is very radical, I think, even radical for Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman. So how do you interpret this? Why has Argentina had so many economic problems to begin with, and what do you make of his solutions? Are they accurate solution to this problem?
The story of Argentina goes back 2 centuries. This is a very complicated place that has added more zeros to the price level than any other country in the world. Its next door neighbor, Brazil, comes in second. So Argentina, in the course of its 2 centuries of independence, has done everything you can do to money, period. It's had new currencies, old currencies, depreciated currencies, hyperinflations repeatedly, defaults repeatedly. So it's a kind of a mystery at some fundamental level why such a well-resourced country, many educated people, a country that was one of the richest in the world a century ago, has been in so much tumult. And when I was studying economics 50 years ago, as I began my freshman year at university, the great economic historian of the day in Harvard University was a man named Simon Kuznets, who invented to a substantial extent the national income accounts, the GDP and the other parts of the national income accounts, and he won the Nobel Prize for it. But he, maybe apocryphally, but the story was that he opened his course each year saying there are 4 types of countries. There are the developed economies, there are the developing economies, there is Japan, and there is Argentina. Now, what that meant was, at the time, Japan was the miracle economy. We would say that maybe about China now. And Argentina already, this was 50 years ago, was the country constantly in crisis. So one of the things about crisis is that if you have had repeated financial crises, you are prone to having more of them, because everybody is always on guard to get out of the national currency before it loses all value. So Argentina is a country of macroeconomists. The taxi drivers are macroeconomists, the storekeepers are macroeconomists. They all have dollars and pesos. They're always ready. They're looking every moment. Will there be a political crisis? Will our currency lose value? And you end up with a lot of self-fulfilling catastrophes. A self-fulfilling catastrophe is when something bad happens because something bad is expected to happen. And if the currency is expected to lose value, then people flee the currency and drive down its value, thereby confirming the fear. And in certain circumstances, with fragile economies, and Argentina is the most classic case, that fear becomes self-confirming on an ongoing basis. And I can tell you a story. I was trying to help not the previous finance minister, but the finance minister just before him, a man named Martin Guzman, a professional, a very decent man.
And he was battling an inflation rate of 40 or 50% per year. And Argentina had a large debt, but actually not, I shouldn't even say that. It had a relatively small debt, but since nobody trusts Argentina, no one would lend it new money. So as the old debt was coming due, a government would normally borrow new money to pay off the old money and keep the debt level pretty much the same. But Argentina has no friends, nobody trusts it. So as the Argentine debt was coming due, everyone wanted to be repaid. Thank you, no more loans. So I was trying to help, since part of my work over the last 40 years has been in economic emergencies, and I helped them negotiate arrangements with their bank creditors, and I helped them negotiate arrangements with the International Monetary Fund. And I said, oh God, this is tough. Nobody believes in Argentina, least of all the Argentines. So after these agreements were reached, I flew to Buenos Aires and I met in a large room with Argentina's poobahs, the powers and shakers. And I said, you know, your situation is not as bad as you think. Your debt is actually not so high. Your need for the central bank to print money is actually not so high. It's just that nobody trusts you. So if we could regain trust, believe me, you know, your balance sheet is actually better than the US government. It's just that in the US, everybody uses the dollar, so you could run big budget deficits. But Argentina's budget deficit was smaller than the US, and Argentina's inflation soared because everyone was always ready to run out of the peso. Okay, so I said, just rebuild trust. I felt pretty good. Compelling speech, showed the data, showed that the US is worse at a fundamental level than Argentina. Flew home, and within days, the finance minister basically resigned because his own political party more or less disowned him after he had gotten these agreements. Oh my God, okay, he's gone. Inflation soars again. And so all that handiwork of saying, you know, there's a way to get out of this, be careful, evaporated, and the inflation eventually rose to more than 100% per year, which is pretty high, although I've dealt with countries in thousands of percent per year. But it was sufficiently high that the Argentines said in this election, we don't want to hear anything about any standard politician. We want something completely new. And the incoming president promised something completely new, specifically to adopt the dollar. And it's probably not going to happen because quickly they backtrack. We don't even have dollars. We can't tie our future to a currency in which we have no reserves. We couldn't back the banking system and so forth. I've not spoken with the new government, although I know the incoming finance minister quite well. I plan to speak with them. The long and the short of it is this is just chronic crisis. So I wouldn't draw too much about general facts from Argentina, because basically almost any time between 1823 and 2023, you could have found the country in crisis. And I've dealt with already in my career with a number of presidents of Argentina. And they don't have the internal political capacity to overcome this yet. So all of this is to say, Argentina, endlessly fascinating, a little bit bizarre. Hopefully they'll get out of it this time. What's interesting now geopolitically is that the outgoing government had joined the BRICS. And that is a good thing. And an important thing for Argentina, because it brings Argentina and the next door giant Brazil together, which is very good for South America, very important diplomatically, very important geopolitically. The incoming government has said, oh, we don't want to have anything to do with China because Milei is being portrayed as an ardent Americanist, so on the American side of this bloc politics. My message to the Argentines is, look, China's your major customer. Don't be dumb. Don't go with the U.S. in this sense. Trade with the U.S., trade with China. Don't get into this crazy mentality of one side or another. And by the way, in this world today, if you have to choose one side or another, I wouldn't go with the American side. Every time a country sides with the United States these days, it ends up in disaster, like Ukraine, because the U.S. is a fading empire. It can't sustain all its promises, not even close. It can't even keep its own public institutions functioning anymore. So my message to the Argentines is you don't have to choose sides. Just be nice, but don't break relations with China, for heaven's sake. Join the BRICS. It's a good thing to do. And maybe within the BRICS efforts this year, which are very important efforts to create non-dollar payments, there'll be something in it for Argentina. That I'm going to try to explain to them. There really is some good news for Argentina in the fact that it won't just be the dollar in the world, that there will be alternative payments, and Argentina shouldn't close itself off from what's going to be an important new force in international monetary economics.
That's all very interesting, because one of the things that I noticed, which has not been mentioned, I think, widely, is that Putin, of course, has just been to the UAE and he's just been to the Saudi Arabia, and he came with a very, very big and very strong delegation of people. And I noticed that one of the people who was there was, of course, Nabulina, who is the central bank chair. And both Saudi Arabia,
I didn't realize she was on the trip, but that is a very interesting
very
part.
It was interesting because I don't think it was announced, but there was a list of, you saw the picture of all the people in Riyadh, and they were all shaking hands. And one of the people who was there and who shook the hands was none other than Nabulina. So she was there. And of course, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are both joining the BRICS in a few weeks. So is Iran. The Iranian president has just been to Moscow. He's had discussions there with Putin. There's just been this announcement of this free trade agreement. And then at the same time, Putin gave this speech at an investment forum run by VTB. And a disproportionate amount of that discussion was about the financial architecture. He was saying that, in fact, that seemed to be the most important thing, that you need to get the financial architecture right domestically in order to move forward. But he was also talking about the new financial architecture. And he said some very interesting things about how the existing financial architecture, which is Western based, is becoming outdated and obsolescent, also in a technological sense. So you have Nabulina there in all of these meetings, and she's presumably talking about all of these matters. She seems to be very interested in them. And she's talking with the big oil producers. And Iran is also a big oil producer. And at the same time, you have all these discussions from Putin about financial systems. And I wonder whether this adds up.
Yeah, the trip was absolutely fascinating, incredibly skillful of Putin at this moment. And it reflects actually three major geopolitical points, all, I think, rather ingeniously brought together. One of them is OPEC Plus, of course. OPEC plus Russia constitutes an enormous part of the hydrocarbons market of the world, and they do a lot of important business together in this, in managing the oil and gas market. So that's one part of the trip. Another part of the trip is clearly regional, which is the integration of Russia with Central Asia, with the Arabian Peninsula, with the Middle East more generally. And you look at the map, and between Russia, China, Central Asia, Arabia, this is building, and of course, India is a member of the BRICS. This is really building most of Eurasia into an integrated geopolitical and economic huge part of the world. And so very, very deft in that regard also. A basic principle of economics, a fundamental principle is neighbors should get along. They trade well with each other. They share ecosystems with each other. And that's the principle that Putin is following because Iran is a neighbor. The Middle East is a neighbor. This is very smart. And then the third dimension, in addition to the oil and the neighborhood, is, of course, the BRICS. And the BRICS started out as the five: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It had already reached an output level measured at what we call purchasing power prices or at international prices larger than the G7. That is geopolitically and economically notable. But now the five are being joined by six more, presumably. Argentina, that's the new addition in South America. Egypt and Ethiopia in Africa, and Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Iran in the Middle East region. Now, you add the six to the original five, you have 37% of world output, according to the IMF purchasing power data, compared to 29 to 30% for the G7. This is a different world, and this is really powerful. And what the BRICS are discussing this year in particular is exactly this financial architecture. And of course, that was greatly hastened by the absolutely awful and mistaken U.S. policies on the dollar. So the U.S. has what Charles de Gaulle, already President de Gaulle, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, called the exorbitant privilege, which is that the dollar is used for about 60% of international transactions of all kinds. The way you denominate a contract, the way you pay to settle a contract, the way governments hold their foreign exchange reserves. So on all three major dimensions of international currency, the dollar predominates. Not exclusively, but overwhelming. And that gives the U.S. a huge advantage. You don't run out of the dollar to what? To the dollar. And so it's not like Argentina where everyone's sitting on the edge as the U.S. debt reaches 100% of GDP. If Argentine debt ever came close to 100% of GDP, they'd be out the door in a moment. But with the U.S. being the currency of the world, nobody flees the dollar. So that's the exorbitant privilege that you get to borrow. You can pump up the money supply. You get some inflation, but you don't get what Argentina or just about any other emerging economy would get. But the U.S. just couldn't leave good enough alone. It had to weaponize the dollar. And this has really been, it's become an addiction. The U.S. generally is addicted to regime change. The U.S. generally is addicted to a foreign policy that says, I don't like you, I want to replace you. Send in the CIA or send in an army, but we get to choose who your government is. Now, this is absolutely disastrous foreign policy, in my view, completely against the UN Charter, completely against international law, but that's the core. And the U.S. figured out 10 or 15 years ago that it could use the dollar as a foreign policy weapon. And the main way that it uses it is in a very crude way, which is to say, one day, your dollars are now our dollars, thank you. Your dollars literally means you have accounts in U.S. banks or U.S. controlled banks. That's what a dollar is in effect, M2 definition of a dollar. So you're holding dollar accounts in institutions that we control. And what the U.S. has come to do increasingly frequently is freeze the money of other countries, of their central banks, no less, of their state enterprises. And the United States did this with Venezuela. Absolutely absurd, but one day Trump and his minions got the idea that they will declare who's the real president of Venezuela, not the actual president of Venezuela, but they named someone from the Venezuelan parliament as president and said, okay, that guy's president. That actually lasted for a few years. And you could see the power of the United States. It's like the emperor with no clothes. About 40 countries said, oh, now Mr. Guaido is president, not Mr. Maduro, who's actually president. So you could see a measure of the U.S. influence that other countries would follow this nonsense. But in the process, they said, Mr. Maduro's no longer president, because we said so, and he no longer has access to the foreign exchange reserves of the country. We give that to this other one. Well, this is absolutely crazy. Even the IMF couldn't, I shouldn't say even the IMF. The IMF couldn't figure this out. It doesn't have the gumption to say to the United States, that's ridiculous. So, oh, no, we have a big issue. Who really controls the foreign exchange reserve? So these games went on for years. Of course, with Russia, it's much more serious than that. The United States froze its estimated $300 billion of Russian financial assets. That's a lot of money, by the way. That was the trick that was going to bring Russia to its knees. It didn't do so, but that's what they thought. We've got Putin cornered. We've got Russia cornered. We'll bring them to their knees by freezing their assets and locking them out of the U.S. banking system, the so-called SWIFT settlement system. Well, Russia quickly figured out, very cleverly, we could trade with China and renminbi. We could trade with India and rupees. Little bit shakier on that front. We can find other ways to transact. And to make maybe a short story long as I have, this year Russia is the leader of the BRICS. The BRICS summit will be in Kazan next October, I believe it is. And so Russia chairs the process, and it's chairing an expert group to come up with non-dollar payments. This is smart. And I kept telling my friends in the US government, don't abuse the dollar. It's going to go away. Because in monetary economics, the first thing you teach is the real economy is the real thing, what you produce, what the factories are. There are many ways to make a settlement, even barter, of course, but there are many currencies you can use. So don't think that your currency brings another country to its knees, because the other country's economy is the real economy. The ability to produce steel, the ability to produce weapons or artillery, the ability to produce automobiles or chips or whatever it is, or oil. And the United States misunderstood that, but really abused the privilege of the dollar. And the dollar will absolutely lose its role in centrality in the international payment system in the coming decade. In monetary economics, just to mention, all my colleagues look at history and say it's a long, slow decline of a currency. And the most famous case is the British pound, which used to be the core of the international monetary and financial system in the 19th century until basically the Great Depression. But the fact is, and so they say, look, the pound hung in there even after Germany was larger, even after the United States was larger, even after Britain's share of the world economy had declined. London remained the center of the international system. But it's not going to happen the same way with the dollar, because it's just too easy technologically to do things differently. And so we will have at least an international renminbi at a minimum playing a big role. And we could have a kind of BRICS, if not central bank, a BRICS monetary fund that serves the role of giving liquidity and credits among the BRICS countries in a way which will mean a non-dollar settlement system.
Professor Sachs, just a few things. As a person in Britain, I can say that the long decline of sterling after Britain lost its hegemonic position in the world economy was an absolute disaster for Britain. You
Yes.
would not want to go through that process again.
And by the way, it's quite interesting just to say the way it manifested. Of course, World War I was awful. The return to gold in 1926 overvalued Britain in the world economy. And Keynes wrote one of his most famous essays in 1926 called The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, who happened to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1926, that put this mistake into place. The 1930s were the Great Depression. World War II, of course, devastating. And the point is, by the end of World War II, Britain had basically gone deeply into debt, even with its own colonies, which became independent countries. And so Britain never quite got out of debtor status again. And it was a very, very heavy, long, painful period. Britain, the center of the world, going to the new International Monetary Fund for an emergency loan. I mean, unthinkable. But, the United States, can you imagine going to the IMF for a loan? It's not impossible. This is exactly what you're referring to.
Absolutely. I remember it. I was in London, of course, when it happened. I can remember the Chancellor turning back at the airport. He had to rush off to Washington to raise funds. And, of course, the fact that we had this currency, which was still an international currency, was doing immense damage to the British domestic economy, which I think people don't understand. So in some ways, it might actually be better for the United States, I would have thought, to go through it quickly than have it, drawn out in the way that it was with Britain. I'm not, by the way, saying that's going to happen, and I'm not making those points. But anyway, that's what I wanted to say. If it's a long process, it's a long agony. It's not based on the British experience.
So, we will have non-dollar payments in the BRICS. That's clearly high on the mind, not only of President Putin, obviously, but also President Lula, who every day asks, and he's the chair of the G20 this year, as well as being a BRICS member, why are we dealing with Russia in dollars, for heaven's sake? And he's very sensible, very logical, and we will move to new payments arrangements, and they will do just fine, thank you. That will be the real lesson.
To talk about the debt just a little bit more, with us owing something like over $800 billion in interest to China, how is it that we have all these lawmakers who are saying that we need to prepare for war with China? I was listening to a hearing in the House the other day, and I couldn't believe I couldn't believe what they were saying about sending more and more troops over to the Pacific to surround China. I think we already have about 250 bases. We're opening a new base in Guam, sending 5,000 Marines from Okinawa to Guam, fully militarizing Guam. And yet we owe China money. How do they square this in their mind?
Well, I can tell you I've been engaged in international economics at the professional level for 43 years, and you add some student years in that. I've never seen a worse public discussion and debate than we have right now. It's almost mindless. It's also filled with lies and many other things, but this warmongering against China it's so wrong, by the way. Aside from the question of debt, do we really want to end the world? Do we really want to have World War III with China right now? These congressmen need to get a life, get out of their handouts and hands out to the military industrial funders and the other lobbyists, and go learn something. Go to China, go have some discussions, go see something, because what they're talking is nonsense, and it's going to get us in deep, deep trouble. So when it comes to the question of the drumbeats of war with China, much more than the debt issue and the economy issue, I'm worried about the survival issue. And I just see so much ignorance in Congress, but maybe it's not ignorance. Maybe they're just expert at fundraising for their reelection campaigns, and that's all that matters to them. But I don't think they know what they're talking about at all right now.
Well, I would agree with you on that. I think many of us at Code Pink would agree with you. And there are some of us who believe that this war in Ukraine is really a prelude to what people like Victoria Nuland, number 3 in the State Department, who was there in the Maidan Square in 2014, encouraging the coup and engineered the transition government, want to see, which is the next war with China. God forbid, right? We know that that would be an absolute disaster.
Overseas, a lot of people call this the Nuland administration, not the Biden administration, because Nuland has been there. She was Cheney's advisor. She was the Bush ambassador to NATO when the NATO enlargement to Ukraine and to Georgia was put, this disastrous idea that got us into this was put into the NATO agenda, by the way, over the huge objections of the Europeans at the time. She was the ambassador to NATO under the Republicans. Okay, then she stays, and then she's the point person for the U.S. role in the overthrow of the Ukraine government in February 2014 that starts this war, because people need to remember, just get on a website and look at it. Even they're admitting it. This war didn't start in 2022 with Russia's invasion. This war started in 2014 with the violent overthrow of the Ukraine government. And go listen to Nuland on tape several weeks before the overthrow, talking about who the next government would be in Ukraine. She's already plotting this with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piot, on a phone call that was intercepted. It's unbelievable. She was then Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. Now she's Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. So she's that deep state, the one that transcends the political parties, that shows this is not Democrats and Republicans. This goes back to Cheney, to Bush. This goes to Obama administration. This goes right up to Biden. Come on. What is this? And we've known all along. Our own diplomats, William Burns, who in 2008 was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, cabled home, and people can find it online because it was covered by WikiLeaks. They can find William Burns' email cable that says, my God, if we push NATO enlargement, this is absolutely a Russian red line. And the Russians have explained, don't do this, why this is so dangerous. And Nuland, okay, close your eyes, just go ahead, everything will be fine. And not everything's fine. Now we're in the middle of one war and at risk of another war, and nothing is fine.
Nothing is fine. I want to ask you, back at the debt, on the topic of the debt, there are those, Jeffrey Sachs, who say, you know what, we don't have to worry about the debt, so-called debt crisis, because our dollar is not backed by gold. We can just keep printing dollars. This is, I think, modern monetary theory. We can afford whatever we want. What would you say to them?
Well, it's technically right. What you do, technically, the Treasury borrows from the open market, and then the Federal Reserve buys that debt from the bondholder, puts money into the economy, and takes the debt back onto the books of the Fed. So it's no longer owed to the public. The debt is now owed to another unit of the government. But what happens is the money supply has gone up. So it is printing money to finance the war. The problem with that is that, again, you can do it to an extent, but if you do it too much, you get inflation. And in 2021 and 2022, we had a blowout of the money supply. I've been a monetary economist for 43 years, I mentioned, international. I never saw it. In fact, it never happened before, such a large increase of the money supply. And then you start having inflation. The first inflation was that every crazy cryptocurrency soared in value, and then the stock market soared in value, and asset prices soared in value, and non-fungible tokens soared in value. But then it got into the commodities markets. Now it's getting into the real, you go to the grocery store, it's into the real economy. And so that's what happens when you print trillions of dollars, which is what we did in 2021, 2022. So you can do it. It's just that you have consequences when you do it. Don't do it and think you're going to get away with it just completely printing money. Lots of governments have tried that for actually a couple millennia. It's called debasing the currency. And you can do it for a little while, but after a while, you better pay your bills. That's the basic point.
Thank you. For those of you who just tuned in, I'm Marcy Winograd for Code Pink Radio. I am with the distinguished Jeffrey Sachs, economist, public policy analyst, who's been doing this for decades, talking about this debt crisis of anywhere from $24 trillion to $31 trillion, and the betrayal of House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, who promised that he would not deliver a blank check for military spending. And yet, all talk of cutting the military budget has suddenly evaporated during this period in which he is negotiating with President Biden and demanding cuts in Social Security and Medicare, food stamps, and so forth. Jeffrey Sachs.
I wish we heard Biden saying, well, at least we'll cut the military budget. I'm not hearing that either. Neither of them.
No. Now, Jeffrey Sachs, let's say you're in the White House. You're in the Oval Office. You have
hard
the
to
pen.
believe.
I'm going to put you there right now. And you're meeting maybe with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and the minority leader, Hakeem Jeffries, and you say, look, this is out of control. This debt we have. We need to cut the military budget, slash it. What are you going to cut in that budget?
First thing I'm going to say, God, we thought we were going to bluff Putin and so forth, and just NATO enlargement was going to go on, and he called the bluff, and now we're in this ridiculous, horrible, tragic, destructive, expensive war. We're going to tell him, okay, no NATO enlargement, you go home. In other words, we're going to negotiate the end of this, which started with these provocations of overthrowing a neutral government and overthrowing the sanity of not moving NATO right up to a nearly 2,000-kilometer border with Russia and all that. So I would stop the war through negotiation. That would be the first thing. We'd save a lot of money. Second, I would say, look, we just had the accounting by SIPRI, which is the Stockholm Institute that keeps track of who spends what on the military. The United States is spending more than the next 10 countries combined. And I'm talking about China among those countries. We're spending 3 times China's military spending. We're spending more than the next 10 countries combined. Let's get this under control. Then I would point out that we have 800 military bases abroad. China, 1 or 2, depending on how you count, maybe a small one in Djibouti, maybe 1 or 2 others. We have 800. Okay, we don't need 800 for our security. It's not adding to our security, it's adding to our debt enormously. So let's get this under control. Let's take out an Excel spreadsheet also and do this right. Real numbers, not gimmicks. Let's see what we need to do in taxes, because God, there's so many loopholes here that it's unbelievable. But at the same time, let's stop waste on the, not just waste, tragic spending on the military industrial complex, because that is where we have wasted so much of our money.
Yes, and when we create, I don't like that word, it has a positive connotation, but when we produce, or the military contractors who are really making a killing off of killing, when they produce new weapon systems, these systems emit tremendous greenhouse gases. So there is that connection, and too often we see environmentalists and peace activists operating in silos. And at Code Pink, we have a War is Not Green campaign because we think it's essential that we integrate these campaigns, because the military is a driver of the climate crisis. The Pentagon is the single largest global institutional emitter of greenhouse gases, consumer of oil and fossil fuels, and too much of that is under the radar. So let's talk about it. Now, let's also talk about what we're doing at Code Pink.
Great.
This week and next week. We have grassroots activists on the Hill, on Capitol Hill, Medea Benjamin, Olivia DiNucci, which who many people met when she disrupted. Well, she's she's disrupted a few times those powers that be that insist on all of this never-ending spending for the military, including Joe Biden. So anyway, they're going to be on Capitol Hill with others, visiting key lawmakers' offices and saying, look, this is our petition. Code Pink is a partner in the Peace in Ukraine Coalition, which represents over 100 organizations. We have a petition calling on Biden, Putin, and Zelensky to support a ceasefire and peace negotiations now. And I thank you, Jeffrey Sachs, because you are one of the prominent signers of that petition, along with others such as Noam Chomsky, Daniel Ellsberg, Dr. Cornel West, Ann Wright, Jack Matlock, the former ambassador to the Soviet Union, even Roger Waters, the co-founder of Pink Floyd, has signed that, as well as Dennis Kucinich, one of my heroes, who was in Congress for many years and a great peace champion. So we are taking this ceasefire petition not only to offices on Capitol Hill, but also fanning out across the country to deliver it to congressional offices, along with a full-page ad that ran in the New York Times last week. Thank you very much, Eisenhower Media Network. And this ad said, let the United States be a force for peace in the world instead of, well, I'm adding this now, instead of a force for war and destruction. There are those, however, Jeffrey Sachs, there are those who disagree with this call for a ceasefire. They think it's controversial. They say, no, we cannot have a ceasefire because then Russia, Putin would end up with this annexed territory in the Donbass and in Crimea. Whether that was an annexation or reunification is certainly up for debate. What would you say to them?
I think it's really important to get to negotiations and to understand the roots of this war. This war came because we kept pushing NATO. And at the end of 2021, Putin put on the table, actually, you want to avoid war, here is a draft Russia-US security treaty. And it had several points, the most important of which is stop the NATO expansion. And you know what the White House said? No way we're going to talk to Russia about NATO expansion. That's our business. It has nothing to do with Russia. Of course it has to do with Russia. We're about to put NATO right up against the Russian border. And so this was calamitously misguided foreign policy in the United States. And it's not just me saying it. The leading American diplomats have been saying this for decades now. Don't do this. George Kennan, William Burns, who's our CIA director right now, warned about this in 2008. And William Perry, who was our Clinton's Secretary of Defense, nearly resigned over Clinton deciding to enlarge NATO because Perry was saying, we're going to start another Cold War with Russia. So it's possible to negotiate. But it's actually been, strangely enough, the United States that has absolutely rejected diplomacy. Americans probably couldn't believe that, but it's actually true. And it's at least two recent occasions. One is at the end of 2021, when Putin was putting a diplomatic initiative on the table. And we said, no, we're not going to talk about it. NATO enlargements, none of your business. That's what we told the Russians. And then at the start of the invasion, just a couple weeks after the invasion, Zelensky said, all right, okay, we could think about neutrality. We should negotiate. Now, I know what happened there because I've spoken to people that were deeply involved in this. Right at the beginning, the Ukrainians said, we could really we don't have to be in NATO. We could have guarantees from other ways. And the Russians said, okay, let's talk. And the Turkish diplomats said, we'll mediate. And so real mediation started. And actually, the former prime minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, got into the act as an informal mediator. Towards the end of March 2022, they actually were working on the draft agreement to end the war. talking about more than a year ago. And the United States said no. The United States said no diplomacy. Nobody questioned that in the mainstream media here, because when's the last time you read in the New York Times a real understanding of this war? It doesn't exist in the New York Times. They just want you to follow what the U.S. government says. And so if the U.S. government says it's all Russia, they don't want to negotiate, okay, then the New York Times will say it's all Russia, they don't want to negotiate. But for those of us who are there watching, seeing, talking, it's so different. We could negotiate this till today, and we're not even trying. And we're not trying because Victoria Nuland doesn't want to try. Every time this issue of negotiation comes up, she says, no, it's not the time. And actually, when General Milley said, this is the time for negotiation, it was the Undersecretary of State that said about the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, no, he's wrong. This is not the time to negotiate. Come on, let's get serious.
Well,
you mentioned the conflict in Ukraine. Of course, now it's not so much in spotlight as more of the news concentrates on what is going on between Israel, Hamas, and the situation in the Gaza Strip. So suddenly we see that Ukraine is not number one, at least not in the foreign policy topics. Do you see any possible way out of the conflict? I mean, a peaceful way out, or at least a satisfactory way out of this conflict? As you mentioned, this is really a proxy war. Of course, the Ukraine is a pawn simply in the game. And in effect, it's a war of Russia against NATO, especially against the United States. So is there a possible change, for example, coming with the next election in the United States? Or is it just wishful thinking?
Well, the thing we should understand, if you're playing poker and you have a lousy hand, and each time it comes to you, you raise the ante. And when the opponent matches you, meets you, you up the ante, even though your hand is lousy. Maybe you're bluffing, or maybe you don't know how to play poker. But that is what the West has done with Russia. Because the West said, we're going to expand NATO to Ukraine. And at first, Russia didn't say, we're going to conquer the territory. Russia just said, don't do that. We respect Ukraine's borders. And all we want is a long-term lease for our naval fleet in Sevastopol. And that was what Viktor Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, delivered between 2010 and 2013. A long-term lease for Russia and neutrality. Okay, we don't want to join NATO. It's, we're in between. Then the United States and Europe really helped to overthrow Yanukovych. We should be clear about this. In February 2014, the United States played a direct role in the overthrow of Yanukovych. And they brought in an anti-Russian government. And at that point, President Putin said, okay, we're not going to let Crimea fall into NATO hands. So we'll organize a referendum, and the people of Crimea, no doubt, overwhelmingly were Russian and wanted to be part of Russia, and voted to become part of Russia. The West said, no, this is completely unacceptable. Then the Russian regions of eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, of course, said, we don't like this new government. It's very radical. It's very anti-Russian. It's trying to cancel Russian culture and Russian language. We want autonomy. And the two breakaway republics of Lugansk and Donetsk took place. And the Ukrainian government attacked them as renegade provinces, but it militarily attacked them. And then came the Minsk agreements, Minsk I and Minsk II, to stop the fighting. And Minsk II, in particular, was endorsed by the UN Security Council And Russia didn't say, we're going to take the Donbass. Russia just said, honor the Minsk II agreement, which gives autonomy to these regions and respect for the Russian language and Russian culture. Pretty reasonable, actually. But the Ukrainians and the Americans said, no way. We're not going to honor an agreement, even though the UN Security Council adopted it. And so Minsk II was never implemented. And interestingly, Chancellor Merkel of Germany was supposed to be a guarantor of Minsk II. And then she admitted in a press conference a year ago, oh, we didn't really mean it. It just gave time for Ukraine to strengthen its defenses and so forth. Well, this is very cynical and very destructive. But the reason I mention it is Russia was not calling for Ukrainian territory, except we raised the stakes in this poker game. And then Russia said, okay, we'll take Crimea. And the United States said, and we want autonomy for the Russian regions. No, we raised the stakes, no autonomy. And then Russia said at the end of 1991, look, this situation is not controlled. Minsk is not being enforced. NATO is still intending to enlarge to Ukraine. This is the last chance. We demand negotiations with the United States. And President Putin put on the table a draft agreement with the US on December 17, 2021. And the United States said, no, we're not negotiating any of that with you. That's arrogance. They did it again. I called the White House at the end of 2021 and spoke with senior official and said, negotiate with Russia, avoid the war. Oh, don't worry, Professor Sachs. Of course, the United States rejected negotiations and the special military operation started. Now, this is also very interesting. At the time of the special military operation, the two regions, Lugansk and Donetsk, claimed independence. Russia did not annex them until September 2022. They claimed independence. Of course, the United States said no, but immediately Zelensky said, okay, we can negotiate with Russia. And in March 2022, there were negotiations, and they were actually going to reach an outcome of Ukrainian neutrality and an end to the war. And then what happened? The United States stepped in and said, no, don't do that. We don't accept that. Well, how stupid is that? You have a losing hand, but they raised the ante one more time. Now, why did they do that? Because they're basically ignorant. In this case, they didn't understand how bad their hand was. They looked at their cards and they said, we're going to impose economic sanctions, and this will bring Russia to its knees. And we will ship HIMARS missiles, and this will destroy the Russian military. This is a fantasy world of these people, these neocons in Washington. So they raised the stakes one more time. They said no to a negotiated peace. They said no to Ukrainian neutrality. And the war continued. And now where are we in this advanced stage of the war? Russia is absolutely destroying one Ukrainian army after another. This is obvious. And the much talked about Ukrainian counteroffensive that was supposed to take place in June 2023 and reach the Sea of Azov. Of course, it didn't reach anything. It didn't do anything other than kill tens of thousands of Ukrainians and cost an unbelievable amount of money in destroyed tanks, weapon systems, artillery, everything. So it's been a disaster. These are the worst poker players I've ever seen. All they do with a lousy hand is keep raising the stakes and keep losing.
Maybe now they are trying to shift focus, shift attention to Gaza or maybe to some other conflicts, because actually when you are losing in one, then you can try to induce more chaos.
You asked me a question which I didn't answer. I gave a long answer.
If there is a way out.
No, but you asked me a question, what to do. And the point I would make is the first thing we should do is stop raising the ante, Stop saying, oh, we're going to defeat them. It's easy. We're going to beat them. No, Ukraine's not going to defeat Russia. And the more that this goes on, the more dead Ukrainians there are. That's just the most basic point. And the whole society has been so profoundly wounded because millions and millions of Ukrainians are in Europe or are in Russia, and hundreds of thousands are dead because of this. So the population has collapsed, and there aren't young people anymore. Now they want to draft kids and young women because they've run out of soldiers. It's terrible. And so we need to stop raising the ante. Now, what would that mean? We need to negotiate. We need to say first, okay, NATO is not enlarging, but Russia, you have to stop taking more and more Ukraine. And what the Russians are going to say at this point is, okay, we keep the following territories. And we're going to have to negotiate over that, because the idea that, no, we don't make any concessions, you're just going to be defeated, is going to end up destroying all of Ukraine. It's raising the stakes on a lousy hand. And we should recognize that we are going to need a political outcome right now, not the one we wanted, but we were so dumb not to take a better deal a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that now we're in a situation where we're not going to get exactly what we, quote, want. But to continue the fighting would absolutely destroy even more.
What worries me most is actually that really the lives of Ukrainians are just taken as a casualty, as something not even worth speaking about.
They don't even talk about it. The leadership is absolutely gross. I'm sure that Zelensky is in a very hard place, but all he talks about right now is throwing more lives to the graves. Frankly, no strategy, no self-awareness, no situational awareness. Okay, it's very sad because the United States talked him out of a peace agreement in March 2022. That was Zelensky's chance, and he lost it. He was inexperienced. When the United States comes and tells you, we have your back, you tend to believe it if you're inexperienced. I tried to tell him, by the way, I really tried to tell the Ukrainians, look, I'm an old guy. I've been through lots of U.S. wars, Vietnam War, Nicaragua, the Gulf Wars, Syria. They never win. Are you kidding? Do you really want to end up like Afghanistan? And they didn't believe me. They just thought, oh, you're a Putin apologist. So they didn't want to hear any of this. But I was telling them the hard facts about American wars, and they didn't want to hear it.
Besides Russia, I'm not sure that Ukraine actually is such a big topic in American policy. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, it's
maybe
definitely diminished. It's a big focus of the political class still, the military-industrial complex and the White House. Maybe for just political reasons that Biden doesn't want to admit what a lousy poker player he is. But the point is, for the American people, they've had enough. There's no groundswell of support. People don't want that. They want to stop this thing. And so in that sense, you're absolutely right. Typically, the public doesn't have much say in this. We have almost no public debate. But Biden's popularity is really collapsing. And if the unhappiness with Biden's foreign policy is very, very clear. So maybe even public opinion is going to start playing a role because we're now in an election year.
I would like to ask you to clear the position on China, because when I look both at the Republicans or at the Democrats, I would say that their views on China are very similar. So they actually have very hostile views towards China. Now there was a summit, APEC, where both presidents, Biden and Xi Jinping, met. Do you see any decline in tension, any hopes that actually the relations, they're probably not going to be friendly, but let's say at least stabilize and would be less threatening for the world?
I'll tell you an interesting thing. When President Xi came to this APEC summit in San Francisco, he met 200 U.S. business leaders, and they gave him a standing ovation. I don't think they would give an American president a standing ovation, but they gave President Xi a standing ovation. Why? China is their biggest market. They both produce in China, they sell in China, they make a lot of money in China, and they want normal relations. What is happening is two things. One, we have a kind of security class in America who are all about American dominance, American hegemony, America being number one. It's a very strange group of people. But this is our foreign policy establishment. Then we have politicians who basically think that, and it's very particular, Trump in 2016 won the election by winning swing states in the middle of America, in the American Midwest, which is our industrial zone. And he won it by saying, China took your jobs away. And when he made narrow victories in those states, the Democrats said, oh, we have to attack China in order to compete politically with Trump. So there are two reasons for the anti-China sentiment in the United States. One, and in the political class, one is this idea of America being the only dominant country. Well, I mean, you know, unless you're playing a board game like the game of Risk, you don't get to be the dominant country in the world when there are other big countries around. So this is arrogance, again, very misguided. Then there is this protectionist politics, which tries to appeal to a few swing states in the U.S. elections. The upshot of this is that the political class, both Democrats and Republicans, are pretty united against China, pretty ignorant from my experience. They don't know China. They don't know Chinese history. They don't have any perspective. They play a dangerous game, like when our Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, flew to Taiwan. So stupid. Sorry. Just why do you want to provoke another superpower?
Thank you for saying that, because we have same representatives who are also provoking China in this kind.
Okay, don't provoke China. Be respectful. Just have normal relations. Don't provoke a superpower. Why? What is in it to poke a superpower? It's stupid. People should think. You know, if there's some, even if you think there's a bully, which China's not, but if you think there's a bully in the schoolyard and you're a little kid and you think they're the bully, is it really smart to go poking them and say, you're a bully, I hate you? No, you're going to get hurt in the end. So you need some common sense. And China's not even bullying. China is just big, successful, dynamic, actually a good trade partner for Europe. So we should treat it normally, respectfully. And the U.S. anxieties should not be Europe's anxieties. This is another area where European politicians are just repeating the words of American politicians. And you know, I know behind the scenes, although it's obvious, why does van der Leyen repeat words almost like Biden? Because she feels that her job is to be with the United States. Maybe she hopes the United States appoints her as the Secretary General of NATO or something. I don't know what it is. No, but that's what she hopes maybe. So this is where Europe makes a big mistake. Just like it did make a big mistake in Ukraine, it would make a big mistake of trying to make an enemy out of China. That's a completely ridiculous losing proposition.
My last question, because our time is coming up, I have to reflect one very current event you already mentioned, and that's the elections in Argentina.
Yes.
Because let's say that the elected president is an unusual personality. How do you view this situation? Is there a danger for BRICS or maybe for other Latin American countries with his very strange suggestions as for foreign policy, as for economics?
Yeah, of course, time will tell. One thing is he won the presidency, but has no control over the Congress. His small parties, and at least for the moment, doesn't have any kind of governing coalition in the Congress. So maybe his ability to do things will require a much broader coalition of forces, and that could be a constraint. But let me just say first, Argentina is a country that has been unstable for its whole history, going back to the 1820s, ever since independence. Argentina has messed up more currencies, had more inflation, and more instability than any other place on the entire planet. This guy won not because of what he says, but because of disgust with the outgoing government, which was delivering inflation of triple digits, more than 100%. You can't really win an election when inflation is triple digit. And I know Argentina quite well, and actually worked with the finance minister just before this one. And he was doing a good job, and he ended up being not forced out. He resigned, unfortunately. But he resigned because his own, I would say, corrupt politicians in his own party were rejecting the normal policies that he was trying to promote. So Argentina is now in yet another cycle of instability. All my professional career as an economist, I've been watching Argentina in amazement, because it's not an impoverished country by any means, and it's got huge natural wealth and very smart people, well-educated class of people, but it has made such a political mess repeatedly, and this could be yet another one. I don't want to say on the first day after the election of this guy that he'll really govern the way he campaigned, because sometimes they become a lot more responsible, but it could be that that he is what he says he is, in which case Argentina is going to face some real troubles. It's regrettable, because I'm a fan of the BRICS. I would like to see them work. Argentina is a new member of the BRICS group. Whether this guy stays in or out of the BRICS or gets kicked out of the BRICS, everything remains to be seen. But I only hope that this guy was making this as a persona, not as a real politics, because his real politics, if delivered this way, would be very, very detrimental to Argentina.